Every crime has more than one casualty. When someone's gone missing, it leaves behind scared and confused friends and family. When a child dies mysteriously, parents drown in shame and question everything they did as a caregiver. The case we're looking at today caused so much pain to one brother that he's still trying to get justice 30 years later. This is the story of a kid who watched his whole world crumble, lost the person he loved most in the world, and is still trying to pick up the pieces after the grown-ups failed him. This is the case of Jacob Landin. For as long as he could remember, Eric Landin always wanted a little brother. His parents, Brenda and Jean, got married when they were super young, and in 1978 had their first child, a boy named Randy, who sadly passed away not long after he was born. Eric was born in 1980, and for the first 5 years of his life, it was just him and his parents. Well, more like Eric and his mom. His dad was a Pentecostal preacher and traveled all over the US for work, leaving Brenda alone with their young son most of the time, with not much money to get by. The day Eric found out he was going to be a big brother was one of the best days of his life. Jacob Jeremiah Landin was born in 1986, and even though his birth brought a lot of joy with it, it didn't make their lives easier in the long run. Their parents were struggling financially before, but even more now, and Brenda was really struggling with the responsibility of looking after two young boys. Jacob was described as a daredevil baby. He was always zooming around, bumping into things, and generally causing chaos. He was totally fearless and loved to laugh. When Jacob was just a few months old, Brenda found out that her husband had been cheating on her. This was the final straw for Brenda, who was tired of being left alone with their kids and no money for most of the year while her husband traveled around and had relations with another woman. She divorced Jean and moved herself and the kids to New Mexico to start a new life. For a while, things really started improving for them. Brenda got a steady job working in a grocery store, and they moved in with her parents, Merlinda and Dalton, who were happy to watch the boys while Brenda worked. However, things didn't stay happy and easy for long. Brenda reconnected with an old friend who she actually knew through her ex-husband, a man known as John. At first, John's intentions seemed to be just friendly. He wanted to reconnect with Brenda platonically and help her out as she got her life together. Eric remembers that he really liked John when he first came into their lives. This guy was super fun for a little kid to be around. He let Eric stay awake watching TV until 2 a.m., and he could even have candy for dinner if he wanted to. After spending so long without a stable male figure in his life, John was a breath of fresh air for Eric. But of course, looking back on this now, Brenda and Eric could see that John was trying to manipulate them. He wanted a fixed place in their lives and acted as the most charming, appealing guy in the world, so Brenda and her kids would accept him and want to keep him around. Unfortunately, because they couldn't see his true nature at the time, it worked. That was when the real problem started. A couple of months after Brenda and John made their relationship official, they decided to move in together. Just a couple of weeks into their life as a new family, Brenda started to notice something was wrong with Jacob. Anytime Brenda wasn't around, Jacob would get strange bumps or bruises all over his body. Since he was kind of rambunctious, the injuries could have been blamed on an accident he caused himself, but these were different from anything he'd had before. Brenda confronted John about it, since he was the other grown-up in the house and often watched the boys when she was at work. He always denied having anything to do with Jacob's injuries and was always quick to put the blame onto Eric. Eric remembers John saying that Eric was jealous of his little brother and that he was playing too rough with him, even hurting him on purpose. Even though he was only young at the time, Eric has no memory of ever feeling any kind of jealousy towards Jacob and definitely has no memory of hurting him, even by accident. It was decided that Eric would be sent off to California to live with his dad for the time being. Brenda didn't know who to believe, but she really didn't want to think that the man she loved was capable of hurting one of her kids. I just want to take a second here to say something about Brenda. I know that when I first heard about this story, I was very quick to judge her for letting John into her kids' lives and believing him over her own son. But as we'll learn later on, John's actions weren't limited to Jacob, and Brenda suffered at his hands too. Even after Eric was sent away, Jacob was still coming up with bruises and marks. Brenda started to get super suspicious of John, so she started limiting how much time she spent with Jacob alone, and most of the time, her mom started watching Jacob again when she was at work. But then one day, one misjudged move changed their whole world. In April 1987, Brenda went to work at the grocery store as she always did and left 9-month-old Jacob in the care of his grandparents. However, that afternoon, they wanted to go to a church service, but they couldn't bring Jacob with them. They asked Brenda what they should do, and she told them to leave him with John. It was only an hour until the end end of her shift, so she was sure things would be fine. In fact, she even said to her mom, "What could happen in an hour?" After that, Brenda started to get a really bad feeling, like something was wrong. She tried to ignore it and just finished her shift until John came running into the store looking for her. He said that Jacob was in a horrible accident and on the way to the hospital. He died after being airlifted to University of New Mexico Hospital. It was determined that Jacob died of subdural hematoma, a very traumatic head injury that causes bleeding on the brain. When doctors realized this, they called the police, as this type of injury in children usually only happens when they've been harmed by a grown-up. John made everyone very suspicious. After being given the sad news that Jacob passed away, all he had to say was this isn't going to look good for me. This looks very bad for me. Not exactly the words of a grieving man. The hospital staff were so concerned when they overheard him that they noted it down on Jacob's chart for when they submitted it as evidence. However, despite all the previous incidents and his strange reaction to Jacob's death, John wasn't arrested. The police did question Brenda about how her son was treated at home, and when they asked if she believed John was capable of hurting Jacob, she said, "I don't think so." They took her word as gospel and left the family alone to grieve. But as the years passed, things went from bad to worse. Without Jacob around, John turned on Brenda and Eric, who moved back in with his mom after Jacob died. Eric was totally devastated when he heard his little brother was dead. Jacob was his best friend and would be in his 30s now. Eric really misses having him around and still thinks about him every day. Despite everything, Brenda and John got married some years later, and they continued to live together, very unhappily. Eric has gone into some detail about the pain and turmoil John has put him through, but hasn't been able to talk about some of the things properly yet because they're too painful. Finally, Brenda managed to take Eric and leave John. This occurred after discovering he was trying to manipulate Brenda's niece into starting a relationship with him. She knew if he was capable of doing that, he was capable of doing anything. But as you can probably imagine, John wasn't too happy when his wife left him. Since she left, John has continued to stalk and hound both Brenda and Eric, turning up to their house in the middle of the night, yelling at them in the street, classic stalker behavior. In 2005, Brenda and Eric sent the case file of Jacob's death to a cold case investigator and asked if they thought the case should be re-examined. No one had ever been charged or found guilty for causing Jacob's death, but at this point, they were more than certain that John was responsible. The investigator took one look at the case and sent it off to the DA, demanding that charges were filed. To their dismay, the DA refused to do so, since the case had passed the statute of limitations for second-degree murder, which is when a murder takes place without being planned beforehand. Second-degree murder was pretty much the best result they could expect to get for Jacob's death, since there was no evidence that John planned to end his life. The investigator also uncovered something that the family had no idea about. John had failed a lie detector test and confessed to the police that he caused Jacob's fatal injuries. However, as his confession wasn't documented anyway aside from the single piece of evidence the investigator found, it wasn't enough to convince the DA to reopen the case. Now in his 30s and ready to fight for justice, Eric and Brenda are working non-stop to get the case opened again by the DA. There is currently a petition on change.org for the Attorney General to reopen the case and finally put John behind bars. I'll be following this case closely over the coming months, and I truly hope that Eric and Brenda can get justice for Jacob. Thanks for watching today's video, you guys. What do you think of this case? Let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below.